Okay, welcome back to another episode of mrumrocks. This is lesson 6 in a series of our tower game, Fat Kids. And in this episode, let me play what's going on right now. If I hit Control Enter, I end up with my enemies are traveling around the stage, and they are so close together they look like kind of more like a centipede. I do want to mention one thing that I changed from the last video, and that is I noticed that if I came down here where I add the enemy, before I had stage here, and one of the things that I noticed was that when I run the program, these guys are actually 100 units off the waypoint in the X direction. And the reason for that is that when I had it added the stage, it's using the coordinates of the stage, which start from this point, but the play area starts from this point. So to change that, I just need to come in here, and when I add the enemy to the stage, I actually want to add it to the play area. So I'll put PA. Remember that my PA is my play area, and so play area is PA add enemy, add child enemy rather. Okay, a couple of things I'm going to change up here right from the beginning. To spread them out a little bit more, I will create another variable right in here. So I'll use the keyword var, and I'm going to put in an enemy launch delay, and this is just going to be a number. And so this guy now is going to be a delay for my enemy, and so I can set this guy equal to, I don't know, let's say 24. Remember, 24 frames is 1 second. Actually, let's start this off at 0 to begin with, and then down below we'll set it to 24. If I come into enemy, init enemy right here, notice that I have this if statement, and I'm going to add right here the same variable enemy launch delay, and I'm going to say that this guy is going to be decremented by 1. By putting the negative, that's the same as saying enemy launch delay equals enemy launch delay minus 1. So every time I get to this point, I'll be decremented. And remember that this is coming in from an event listener, enter frame, so I'm going to get this event every time I enter a frame. I'll come down here to init enemy, and so in effect this is happening 24 times a second, and if I start at 0, I want to add a condition here, and I'll use the AND operator. So logical AND means that I have two conditions. This condition and this condition both have to be true for me to enter into this if, and I'll say that the enemy launch delay has got to be less than 0. Now, if I add one more time down here, and enemy launch delay equals to 24, what will happen is, starts at 0. The first time I come in here, it'll decrement to something less than 0. If enemy launch delay is less than 0, then I will come in here. This has to be true also, by the way, so max enemies has to be less than 11, and this has to be true. But until I reach my maximum number, I'll keep coming in here every time this guy gets decremented down to 0. But at the bottom of this, I set it back up to 24. So I come here, it gets decremented to 23, then 22, all the way back down to -1, in which case this is true. And if I don't have all my enemies up, I'll come back in and build a new enemy. Okay, so now if I run this, let's just take a quick look. Notice that my enemies are spread out a little bit more, and of course I can change that to whatever degree I want just by adding more value here. For instance, if I say 48, they'll come out every 2 seconds, and I can have control over how often these enemies are being initiated. Enemy launch delay. Okay, now the other thing I wanted to add was another array. I have an array of waypoints, and now I want to set up an array of enemies. So I'll say variable, let's say enemies, and this is going to be array. I'm setting this up here, by the way, so that the scope is the entire class. I can access this array of enemies anywhere inside, whereas if I had declared it in here, it would only be visible between these two curly brackets. However, I do need to use the keyword new, and so I'm going to say enemies is equal to new enemy. Oops, new array rather, sorry. And this new array, again, I use parentheses, so the keyword new is where I create an instance or an object associated with my array class. And again, I'm not telling ActionScript how long this is going to be, but what happens is every time I'm going to create an enemy down here, So right before, let's say, I add it to the stage, I'm going to take the enemy that I've created, I'm going to push it into my array of enemies, and I use the method push to do that, and I put what I'm pushing into my array right here. And so in effect, I'm going to take my enemy and I'm going to push that into my array of enemies. And just for the sake of seeing what this looks like, let's go ahead and do a trace. And we'll just take a look and see what's inside this. So for instance, I can say enemies right here is equal to, and then we'll say plus enemies, and this should give me a view of what's inside my array. And so let's go ahead and run this, and I'll notice that first of all I have 1, and now I have 2, and now I have 3, and so each new enemy that I'm creating is being pushed into my array of enemies, which is what I'm going to need to test and see which of these guys are getting hit. Alright, it's going to stop wherever I tell it to stop. In this case, I'm setting it equal to a maximum of 10 enemies, and I'm ready to go. Now, at this point, I'm going to add another function, so I'll just add that in the next segment by adding a couple of event listeners, but we'll start that next. Okay, now that I've got my enemy array made, and I'm pushing each enemy into my array of enemies, and my array of enemies is named enemies, what I'm going to do is add another event listener. I'm going to update my enemies from inside of the PhahtKids main stage here. And so I'll create another event listener. In fact, I'll copy this whole thing, and instead of calling the same function, I'm going to create a new function called enemy loop. And so enemy loop is going to loop through each of my enemies. The reason I'm going to do this is that once I have my array of enemies, I'm going to create an array of bullets. I'll loop through each of these to test and see when a bullet is hitting a particular enemy. Now to do this, I'll create a function, and I can create that right down here. And whoops, not that way. I'm going to create, let's say I take this and let's copy it to save a moment. And I need to create the same title that I have over here, enemy loop. And so my enemy loop is going to be this guy. It's going to receive this parameter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little for loop in here. And this for loop is going to go through every element in my array. Now, since I don't know what particular length is, every time I come in here, the array could be a different length, but there's a way of dealing with that. So I'll create a variable, and I'll call it enemy index, and this is going to be an int, and I'll set it equal to 0. And then I want to say enemy index has to be less than the enemies, and there is a method called length. So this is simply going to check and see how long my array is. If my array is 0, I won't go into this at all, but if it has some value, if it has some length, I'll come in here and do this, and of course then I just increment enemies. So enemy index. And now what I'll do is to check and update this, what I can do is I can go into each enemy, and the way that I do that in an array, remember, is I say enemies, and I'll use my square brackets, and I'll say EI. So when EI is 0, this is enemy 0 is the first element of this array. And when EI is 1, I get enemies 1, and that's the second element of the array. And since enemies is of type enemy, I can use the methods in that type. And so one of the methods that I have in this type is update enemy, and use my parentheses to indicate that that's a method, and that almost will work. Let's go back here and notice something. To make this work, a couple of things I want to do is I want to notice that update enemy is right here, and so to make this work, I'm already calling it here, so I need to stop calling it from my event listener, which means I'm not going to pass in a parameter. And the one other problem we have is that when I created this, I marked it private. So if I were to run this right now, it wouldn't move anything because I can't access that particular method. But if I change this to public, so let's change this to public now. So now I can access this method from other classes, and if I hit Control Enter at this point, everything runs fine. So all I've done is I'm using, instead of updating enemies from within the enemy class, I've moved the function of that over to here by adding an event listener for a method called event enemy loop, and I've just simply added that in. Now I can do the same thing over here with bullets, and so I'm going to do that. I'll pause the video, I'll create all that code because it's essentially the same thing, and then we'll look at it together in just a moment. Okay, now that we've created the enemy loop, now we're going to create, or I've just created the bullets loop, and so notice I've got an array bullets. Again, it's located up here between the class and the constructor function so that it has, the scope will be the entire class. And then I had to instantiate this bullets array right here by using the keyword new. So now I have an object that's actually created, and that is an array called bullets. Its length is variable. It can be any length I want it to be. And then as I come into this part, notice I have a bullet loop just like I have the enemy loop. So so far this is exactly the same, but we're going to have a few differences, and I'll get to that in just a second. But let's look at the bullet loop. Same thing I did before. Bullet loop is now being called by its own event listener. It's going to call bullet loop just like I called enemy loop down here. But the bullet loop is going to have a bullet index. Bullet index is less than bullets.length. So again, this is the length of my array. If the array doesn't exist, if the length is 0, then 0 is not less than 0, so I won't go in here. But it says if bullets bi does not equal null, that means it does exist, then I'm simply going to go through each element. So if bi, let's say, goes from 0 to 5, I'll go through 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'll go through each of the 6, and now I'm calling a method called update bullet. Now, since this is attached to this, bullets, which is an array, is a whole array of bullets, but this is one particular bullet. For instance, if bi is 0, this is going to be the very first bullet in the array of bullets. So since this is a bullet, I can access any methods inside that. So let's come over here to bullet, and we'll take a look and see what's there. Do I have? Yes, I do. I have a method called update bullet. So before I was calling that with this event listener, but now I can get rid of that. In fact, now I have nothing inside my constructor function. And notice when I took out the event listener, I also took out my parameter. But now I'm going to be calling this as I enter every frame from my PhaTkids class. And so that's going to work out fine. The problem is this. In the PhaTkids class, I'm actually constructing my enemies right here. So that means that my enemy loop has access to enemies because they're in the same class. But that isn't the case, or it wasn't the case with the bullets, because in the bullet, the bullets are actually created in the turret class. So right here where it says fire turret, every time I click on the screen, I'm calling a method called fire turret, and it's here that I'm creating the bullets. Well, I'm going to change that. I'm going to cut this code out, and I'm going to replace it with this code. And this is going to get a little bit tricky, but you can really pause the video and think about this. What's going on here is that I'm saying if the parent is not null. So the parent means that if I'm in the turret class, this is the parent of the turret. And you can see what this is. If you get curious about this kind of stuff, you can just do a trace, and you can see what all of these things are. For instance, if I say, just take the word parent here and say, copy that in. So parent, let's say equals, and I want to see what that is. Parent equals, and I can say parent. And now if I run this code, I can see what the parent is. I'm going to do that in a couple moments. But for right now, notice that this line of code is kind of strange. What I'd like to do here is just say the parent of the turret is going to be wherever I made the turret. And I made the turret back in PhaTkids. So since I'm going to be making the turret where it says init turret, I'm making the turret in PhaTkids. The parent of the turret is the PhaTkids class. But there's a problem. For some reason, ActionScript doesn't know that this is a movie clip, so I have to cast it as a movie clip. The reason for this, I've done a little bit of research, and people are confused about this all throughout the internet, but the general idea behind this is that when ActionScript compiles the program, it's at least possible to recast PhaTkids as something else. So to make sure that that hasn't happened, it forces you to recast parent as a movie clip. And so now, if this method exists in PhaTkids, I'll be okay. So let's go back to PhaTkids and make sure I have a method called makeBullet. And so when I say parent is movie clip, since the turret was created in PhatKids, that highlighted part right here refers to PhatKids. Let's make sure this method exists, and I have created it, but I commented it out, so let's go ahead and say right here I will remove the comment, and now makeBullet exists in my PhatKids class, and it does exactly the same thing that I had been doing in the turret class. It makes a bullet and it creates a new bullet. However, here notice that I have turret.x. When I did this in the turret class, it just said this.x, or it just had x, because x refers to the x coordinate of whatever object I'm in this case turret. But now that I'm outside of the turret class, I have to say turret.x. The problem with that is that this line of code is created inside this init turret, and the scope is between these two curly braces. So right here, I don't know what turret is. And so to take care of that, I'm going to move this part of the code. I'm just going to move it up to the top. And the same place that I'm declaring these other variables, now turret can be seen throughout the entire class. Another way to say that is the scope of the turret, since it's declared up here, is the entire class. And notice that I also have a array of turrets, and so I'm going to set that up. Let's see, I don't have that made yet, so I'm going to create an array of turrets right here. Actually, I just have one turret. I'll do that later. So at this point, I call init turret. My turret is initialized down here. I have a turret X, a turret Y, a turret rotation. And so now when I create a bullet, back in my turret class, when I hit the screen, I'm going to go ahead and add event listener to update turret, and I'm going to go ahead and say makeBullet. Again, it's going to say PhatKids.makeBullet, so I'm going to come over here, and now I'm going to know what turret is because I moved that to the top. Okay, having done this, let's see if this is going to work. So I'll hit Control Enter, and I don't have any errors, and if I shoot a bullet, that's all looking pretty good. The one thing you'll notice is that some of my waypoints appear to be missing, and I just wanted to point out what's going on there. It is the case that if I come back to my FLA file and I look at my play area, which is right here, I can go to any of these waypoints on the play area, and if you select them, they're just little movie clips. And so if I go to properties, I can say style, and I can change the alpha down to 0, and then they can't see. The alpha is the degree of opacity, and that's going to vary from 0 to 1. And if I change that, for instance here, I can see it now. It's just sort of goes to 1, fully visible, down to 0%, and that's invisible. And I'm doing this for all of my waypoints so that I can't see them. I don't want to see them. Now I can do artwork on the play area, so it looks like my characters or my enemies are following a little path. But if I run this right now and look at this, let's go ahead and see what happens. I say Control Enter. Now all of the waypoints are gone, but they're still there, and my ships know where they are, and I can follow them. In the next video, we're going to add one more important change, and that is we're going to add a hit test so that when my bullet hits the enemy, both the bullet and the enemy will be removed. And so that's it. That's it for today. Bye-bye.